The way that Spotify would generate playlists from songs that I would pick somewhat resembles a slot machine. It felt like I was on a winning streak for so long, and then all of a sudden, my luck ran out. Well, it's over. We broke up, officially. As of this month, September 2025, I am no longer a Spotify premium user. I have cut the cord on Spotify, but not for the reasons you might think. So, I was initially going to do an entire video essay about the current Spotify controversy. To speak briefly about it, many people are calling for a boycott on Spotify and for people to unsubscribe from Spotify Premium. This boycott encompasses things such as the inequitable payouts that artists have when they put their music on Spotify, all the way to the corporate practices of Spotify as a corporation, including of its CEO Daniel Ek, including investments that the company Spotify has, as well as comments that Ek himself has made. I'm not going to get super into it, but I will link some more information in the description. Suffice to say, if you're part of any left-leaning or social justice-oriented circle right now, you're probably hearing about people cutting the cord on Spotify and encouraging people to do the same. I would describe this call for a boycott as being in the vein of what we used to call conscious consumerism. Conscious consumerism being a turn of phrase that originates in the late 80s and early 90s to describe people having more ethical buying practices when they go to get consumer products. That is to say, supporting companies that have better practices and shaming companies that have worse practices. I want to ground it there because I think that that context is really important. The original conscious consumer movement came out of an era of globalization in which products were increasingly being manufactured in sweatshops and other sorts of very unethical and exploitative practices. So I find it interesting to apply this paradigm because Spotify is not really selling a good, it's selling a service. A product nonetheless, but not one you could say is manufactured in a sweatshop. So right now, people are looking for ways to take a stand against Spotify and their business practices which people consider to be inequitable and exploitative. I go back to that Naomi Klein interview, or maybe it was a speech that she gave that kind of delves into this very topic. She is the author of books such as The Shock Doctrine and Doppelganger. And in this speech, she recounts going to many different college campuses and social groups to give lectures about globalization and sweatshop labor. And she recounts how, inevitably at every one of these talks, one person would raise their hand and ask, "What can I do personally as a consumer to help stop sweatshop labor?" And the answer that Naomi Klein came to give was that there's nothing you can actually do. It is impossible for one person or one consumer to change the world systems at play that enable globalization and sweatshop labor. And perhaps it's a bit of Western chauvinism to assume that one, as a consumer in the West, very far removed from these sorts of practices, can have a direct impact. Now, I'm not saying this to dismiss the concerns of the boycott Spotify lobby, but I do want to problematize a little bit of this notion of boycotts as efficacy. To be clear, I do totally support most of the boycotts that have recently emerged, especially in the wake of 10/7/23. But I don't really intend to shame people who have not yet cut the cord on Spotify or who do not plan to participate in this particular boycott. Mostly, I just want to give my perspective on why I personally cut the cord on Spotify, and maybe it'll be valuable or useful to someone out there. So let's get into it. I started using Spotify in about 2014 or maybe 2015. I think I probably got on Spotify in 2014 and then I started subscribing to Spotify Premium in the next year or sometime soon thereafter. So I've always loved listening to music and I found that Spotify was a convenient conduit for that. Also, in about 2014, 2015, I experienced a hard drive failure. In the scope of that hard drive failure, I lost all of the music that I had collected from childhood into teenagerdom into early adulthood. All the music that I had previously listened to in a file format was gone. So I was kind of mourning that in a sense, but I also did need a replacement for the music that I had lost. And Spotify came to fill that void. So I was a very happy and content Spotify user for many years. There was a time in which I thought Spotify could read my mind. The way that I tend to use Spotify is to queue up a random song using the search function and then have Spotify generate a playlist of relevant songs that come after it. I will also use Spotify to listen to entire albums or to make my own playlist, but I tended to use it in this particular way. Particularly in like 2020, 2021, I felt that this way of using Spotify worked perfectly for me. If I put on a random song, let's say like a Samantha Mumba song from the early 2000s, it would generate a shuffled playlist that would be exactly what I wanted to listen to after that song. For example, early 2000s Britpop with maybe a couple American or international songs thrown in. And this kept me using the app for hours on end. I'm the kind of person that needs some sort of music or sound to concentrate on what I'm doing. And I found that Spotify's product at the time allowed me to remain in flow. Fast forward to maybe late 2022, somewhere around that time, and this feature of the product stopped working. I do not know what happened on the back end of Spotify, but what used to happen stopped happening. All of a sudden, the playlist that would generate after selecting one song from the search function would be horrible and all over the place. It would jump erratically between time periods and genres, and it just wouldn't be what I wanted. Especially by 2024, 2025, I would find myself having it generate playlists and me skipping 2 or 3 songs at a time because it wasn't what I wanted to hear. So to be transparent, this was the primary reason why I decided to cut the cord on Spotify. The product was no longer something I wanted to pay for. Yes, it's true that I did not like Spotify as a company, but at the end of the day, the product was something I was no longer willing to pay for. Now, people in my sphere had been calling for other people to cancel Spotify since probably at least 2022 or thereabouts. Specifically, friends of mine who were DJs or independent musicians had long been critical of Spotify's business practices. Especially at that time, they pushed Bandcamp as an alternative. And yes, I do purchase music on Bandcamp from time to time. I do not feel that it is an equivalent product to Spotify, however. I think it's fair to say that by the time that Spotify's product had changed for the worse, I was already hooked. I don't mean hooked in the narcotic sense of the word, but I do mean it in a particular way that's maybe more akin to gambling. The way that Spotify would generate playlists from songs that I would pick somewhat resembles a slot machine. You don't know what it's going to pick, but you're still incentivized to keep playing. It felt like I was on a winning streak for so long, and then all of a sudden, my luck ran out. And this kind of paradigm of gambling has been applied to other websites and apps in the ways that it kind of gamifies your attention. And I find it apt because that's what it felt like was happening. In some way, I was using Spotify Premium as a sort of maladaptive coping mechanism. I was using it as a way to keep myself focused and also to stave off some anxiety. So I was diagnosed with ADHD when I was 4, and I've also struggled with anxiety for most of my life. It's true that music does help me focus. If I really need to concentrate, I will put one song on loop for an hour or listen to an album that I love all the way through. So in a way, Spotify was a value neutral way for me to do that very efficiently. But in a darker sense, it also interplayed with my anxiety. I would find myself walking down the street blasting music just so that I wouldn't be made anxious by some of the stimuli around me. Or even if I was home, using listening to music for hours on end as a way to not sit with my thoughts. Now, I live in New York City, so it's not surprising that I might need music to cope with the distracting ambient environment or to help with the downtime of being on the subway. But for the standards that I hold myself to, I feel like I was using it as a way to distract myself from further introspection. I was passively listening to Spotify when perhaps writing or journaling or watching something more actively educational might have been more helpful. And yes, listening to music is an important form of leisure. But I will also admit that I think the way I was using Spotify was not super healthy. That is to say that there are things I could be doing that are more enriching, perhaps more honoring of my needs. I think I might personally benefit from doing music in a way that is not just listening to it passively for hours on end. A couple of months ago, I bought a drum. This drum in particular is a cajon, which comes from the Afro-Peruvian musical tradition. In the case of a cajon, you kind of sit on it and play below you with your hands. Throughout the summer, I was able to take my cajon to the park and practice drumming. This is something that I had never really done before, and it also felt weird because I wasn't trying to monetize how I was learning how to play the drums or really do anything that felt like it was a part of hustle culture. It was just pure leisure for me. And it's felt so therapeutic. To go to the park and play the drum for 45 minutes or an hour and a half just feels really nourishing to a part of me. It's things like this that I feel like are really welcome substitutions for just listening to music on Spotify. At this point in the video, you're probably expecting me to endorse a competitor product such as Apple Music or Tidal. No, not gonna happen. As it were, I'm using cutting the cord on Spotify as an excuse to do a little bit of an introspective social experiment, to see what it's like to be alone with my internal monologue. To see what it feels like to not scratch the itch of the impulse of, God, I just really want to listen to this song right now. In a sense, dopamine fasting, but also just trying to be a little bit more aligned with myself, a little bit more in harmony with myself. We'll see how long it lasts. It may last a couple weeks or a couple months before I decide that I need something like Spotify Premium back in my life. In the meantime, I'm taking on this sort of return to myself and just seeing how it goes. Alright folks, that's the video. Thanks again for making it this far. Are you also cutting the cord on Spotify Premium? If so, what are you doing instead? Let me know down below in the comments. comments. Also, if you have any cool alternatives to Spotify the product or the practice of streaming music, then feel free to put those down below in the comments as well. This is Hassan with the Diaspora Gothic channel. Remember to stay connected, stay rooted, and stay dramatic. Bye.